Anne, I see you with the first mic, and who has the second mic, so I know who's ready. So if you'd like to go ahead, and maybe Anne, do you want to stand so everyone can see you and launch into your question?
Michael, thank you very much. That was a wonderful history. How can this happen? What's the pathway to make this parliamentary forum and the reform of the committees? And what's the pathway? Can that happen soon? Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for the question. Quite simply, encourage all of you here to email your local member of parliament and put pressure on them, whether you live in Guelph or elsewhere, to focus on reforms to the House of Commons that will rebalance that power. There are opportunities in every parliament to make rule changes that will rebalance power. What's happened over the last 2-3 decades, in my experience, is that often when the rule changes in favor of leader power, it flies through quickly through the House of Commons without much debate. But when the change is the other way, to rebalance power, to give MPs a greater say and leaders less of a say, there's huge fights that are put up in the House of Commons. Ultimately, MPs react to one thing, and that's their constituents. And so the more that your group across the country can put pressure on locally elected MPs to make this one of their priorities, the better chance we have of making these changes a reality.
Ron is looking for the mic over there. Yes, please.
Welcome to our two fine MPs. Michael, I thank you for the history lesson you gave us back to the beginning of Parliament. And I learned a lot tonight, and I agree wholeheartedly with what you say. I wasn't happy with the last election result. I'm quite open to say that. However, in the end of the day, I accept the fact the person with most votes gets the chair, or whatever you like to call it. I don't see a reason, if we have 5 or 6 parties, obviously 51% of the vote is not going to occur. You're not going to get 51% to head the party off. I asked the question, so why would we change something if the first person you vote for, and why would we go to second, third, fourth choices or other means?
To say earlier is there's a real risk to health of a democracy when an agenda represented by a leader of a party is actually opposed by most of the people in that democracy and yet enacted because of the vagaries of the voting system that actually does not result in a democratic decision. So for instance, the parliamentary committee on which I served was not the first parliamentary committee to study our voting system. The first committee to look at it was in 1920, inspired by the change I mentioned earlier that the Parliament in Ireland was set up with single transferable vote. To explain single transferable vote, you cluster the ridings, you have multiple MPs from the same area, and you get to vote for, say, if it's a cluster of 3 ridings, you get to pick your first, you get to rank ballot your 3 choices. It's a very interesting voting system. It has a remarkable alignment between how people voted, for what party they voted, and the number of seats elected. Because you wouldn't intuitively say that was always going to happen, but it seems to. I should mention one thing. There'd be absolutely nothing wrong with first past the, sorry, Steve, it's a little bit far from me. There'd be absolutely nothing wrong with first past the post if there was no such thing as political parties. Right? Because that's what means the popular vote diverts from the seat count. Oh, that might be it too. Hello? I don't know. In any case, where the popular vote diverts from the seats that are in the Parliament, you have a really big risk. I would put you, when Peter Russell, who's the parliamentary, I mentioned earlier, one of Canada's leading political scientists, so this just doesn't, oops, now it's working. Okay, thank you, someone did something. It wasn't Steve and it wasn't me, but Peter Russell was asked by the parliamentary committee members to name something that went wrong in democracy when, and I hope this won't be too personal or close to the bone for anyone, but when Stephen Harper, with 39% of the popular vote of the 60% of Canadians who voted, formed a majority government. And Professor Peter Russell's response was climate change, because the vast majority of Canadians wanted action on climate change. The vast majority of Canadians supported the Kyoto Protocol. Canada became the only nation on earth to legally withdraw from Kyoto. These are large-scale threats. They are not susceptible to quick fixes. I believe it's really dangerous, and that's why I think the answer to your question, why would we change it? It's true. Depending on how many people, and by the way, the Parliamentary Committee in 1920, I forgot to tell you what they determined. They determined that as long as there were more than 2 political parties in Canada, and at that time there were 4 or 5 typically, they said first past the post is a system that doesn't work for any country that has more than 2 parties. So the conclusion from parliamentarians for nearly 100 years has been that the system we have doesn't work well for Canada. The first committee to actually answer the question, what should we bring in instead, was our committee that reported in December of 2016. So I still believe the change will happen. I think right now our best chance to have it happen federally is the change that will happen in British Columbia, where the British Columbia government under John Horgan of the NDP exists because, again, it's really important for people to understand the system of government and understanding that it was a really good example of Westminster parliamentary democracy working well for the 3 Green MLAs representing the 17% of the popular vote that voted Green, being able to exercise their balance of responsibility and say to the NDP, you can govern, but here are the conditions, the key votes that will have to go through a predetermined document of our own commitments to not surprise each other, to trust each other, and one of those key commitments is a referendum on electoral reform that will take place in fall of 2018 in BC. So we will get to electoral reform one way or another, but as I see it, it's not just there are many systems and some are better than others kind of question. It's a danger to democracy when a party leader with as much power as party leaders have now accumulated in Canada, and yes, let's reduce the amount of power they've accumulated, to form government with less than majority support if they're going to exercise a majority parliament.
I think it's important to put this all into a bit of a context, which is that a century and a half ago, political parties did not have the dominant role they do today in our system. Till 1972, party names did not appear on the ballot. If you were voting in the 1968 election, 3 items would have appeared on the ballot: the person's name, their occupation, such as teacher or engineer or farmer, and their home address, so that people could judge where they lived. So prior to the 1972 election, we literally you didn't vote as much based on parties. Candidates would often declare which affiliation they had, but often that was a loosely applied affiliation and not something that they were held to. The other change that we had prior to the 1970s was that political parties weren't publicly funded. The whole system of political tax credits and subsidies came in post-1970s, and today political parties receive hundreds of millions of dollars in public subsidy, in taxpayer dollars. You know, in the last, I don't know if you realize this or not, but in each of the campaigns here in Guelph, 60% of the candidates' expenses were paid for by the federal treasury. So if a candidate here in Guelph spent $100,000, $60,000 were paid for by tax dollars. $40,000 was paid for by fundraising by the candidate. When you give $100 to a political party in this country, you receive $75 back on your tax return. So even those donations are subsidized. And the national campaigns are subsidized to a tune of 50%. So campaign in the last election, I think cost upwards of $30–40 million. Half of that was paid for by the federal treasury. So political parties today have immense budgets. That's just during elections. In between elections, political parties receive vast sums of money. The Prime Minister receives a budget of close to $40 million just for political staffers. That hires hundreds and hundreds of staffers whose only job it is to protect the king. The Leader of the Opposition receives a budget of $8 million for political staffing. $8 million to hire political staffers whose only job it is to protect the king. And so it goes for the NDP as well. And so we now have political parties that have immense powers, and that wasn't true a century and a half ago. So because political parties have become so powerful, and because leaders now completely control parties, and when I say completely, the party exists at the pleasure of the leader. The local electoral district association here in Guelph for both the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, and other parties exists at the pleasure of the leader. My leader could wipe out the Guelph EDA tomorrow. He just requires his signature and the signature of 2 officers that he appoints in order to take the association out and replace it with a more compliant association. So because of these immense powers, Canadians intuitively understand that parties are where the power's at, and they vote accordingly during federal elections, more often for the party or the party leader rather than the individual candidate. So one solution to this challenge is proportional representation. But another solution is to deconstruct the power of political parties and return power back to the way it once was structured, which is to give individual candidates and individual MPs a greater say in the running of our democracy, taking away power from party leaders and political parties.